The wagon wheels creaked like dying animals as they struggled through the deepening snow. Maggie Wilson clutched her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, one hand instinctively resting on her swollen belly as the biting wind found every gap in the canvas cover. 6 months pregnant and widowed barely 3 weeks ago, when Samuel's cough had turned to blood in the night, she now sat alone at the edge of the caravan, watching as her breath formed clouds in the frigid mountain air. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. We need to make camp before nightfall. The shout came from the front of the train, where Ezekiel Montgomery rode tall on his chestnut stallion, its coat gleaming even in the weak winter light. The wagon master's voice carried authority that the 30-odd travelers had come to both respect and fear over the 3 months since leaving Missouri. These mountains don't forgive those who don't respect them. Maggie knew that truth better than most now. The Sierra Nevadas loomed around, them like sleeping giants, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds that promised more snow before morning. The pass ahead that would lead them to California's gold fields, and the new life she had dreamed of with Samuel was now a death trap of ice and wind, closing a little more with each passing hour. She felt the baby kick, strong and insistent, as if protesting the cold. "I know, little one," she whispered. "We'll be warm soon." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Nothing had been warm since Samuel died, leaving her alone with his dreams and the child he would never meet. The caravan slowed to a halt in a sheltered valley, the towering pines offering some protection from the relentless wind. Men jumped, from wagons to unhitch exhausted oxen, while women gathered what meager firewood could be found beneath the snow. Maggie climbed down carefully, her back aching from the day's journey. Her fingers were stiff with cold as she reached for her own small bundle of kindling stored beneath the wagon seat. "Mrs. Wilson." The voice made her stiffen. Ezekiel Montgomery stood behind her, his shadow falling across the snow like an omen. His face, handsome in a hard way, betrayed nothing of his thoughts, but his eyes, pale as winter ice, swept over her form with calculation. "A word, if you please. Mr. Montgomery." She straightened as much as her condition would allow, meeting his gaze with the same quiet dignity that had carried her this far. "The men have been talking." He glanced toward the gathering darkness beyond the camp's perimeter. "This storm is worsening. We've lost too much time already, and we're running dangerously low on supplies." "We all knew the journey would be difficult," Maggie replied, her voice steady despite the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "The spring thaw will come too late for half of us if we don't make decisions." His words cut like the wind. Difficult decisions. Maggie felt the first genuine fear begin to curl in her stomach. What kind of decisions? The kind that ensure most of us survive. Montgomery's gaze flicked to her belly and back to her face. "You're slowing us down, Mrs. Wilson. Your condition, your extra rations, the space you take in the Henderson's wagon that could hold more supplies." "I've never asked for extra rations," she protested, heat rising to her cheeks. "And I work as hard as any—" "That's not the point." Montgomery stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You have no husband to speak for you, no family in the train. You're carrying a child that will require more resources. We simply don't have. One life, two perhaps, against 28 others." The calculation in his voice made her blood run cold. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Montgomery?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "There's a trapper's cabin about 2 miles east of here. Old place, probably abandoned, but it has walls and a roof. You'll have shelter there until the spring thaw, when another party might come through." Understanding dawned with horror. "You're leaving me behind." "I'm offering you a chance, Mrs. Wilson, more than many would." He reached into his coat and produced a small burlap sack. 3 days' worth of provisions. A knife, matches, more than fair considering. Considering what? Her voice shook now, all pretense of strength crumbling. Considering you'd be dead already if this were nature's way. His voice hardened. The vote's been taken. This isn't a discussion, it's a courtesy. You leave at first. Light tomorrow before the others wake. I'll show you the trail myself. The others agreed to this? Maggie whispered, looking around at the people she'd traveled with for months, shared meals with, mourned alongside when sickness took their loved ones. They didn't disagree, Montgomery replied. The storm is getting worse. We need to lighten our load, and she was cargo now, expendable in the brutal mathematics of survival. That night, Maggie didn't sleep. She lay in her corner of the Henderson's wagon, listening to the wind howl like a hungry wolf outside the canvas. Her hand traced circles on her belly, feeling the child within stir restlessly, as if sensing its mother's despair. In the darkness, she allowed herself to weep silently, tears freezing on her cheeks almost as soon as they fell. Before dawn, as promised, Montgomery shook her awake. No words were exchanged as she gathered the few possessions she could carry. Samuel's pocket, watch, a small book of pressed flowers from home, a blanket and the clothes on her back. The provisions Montgomery had promised were tied in a bundle that he thrust into her arms before leading her to the edge of the sleeping camp. East, he said, pointing to where the faintest lightening of the sky suggested the coming dawn. Follow. The deer trail down until you reach a stream. The cabin is just beyond. The others won't even know I'm gone. Maggie realized aloud, her voice hollow. What will you tell them? Montgomery's expression hardened. That nature took its course. A tragedy, but not unexpected in your condition. He was going to tell them she died in the night. A chill that had nothing to do with the snow settling on her shoulders ran through her. God sees what you do here, she said quietly. God isn't crossing these mountains, Montgomery replied. I am, with as many as I can save. Without another word, he turned and walked back to camp, his footprints quickly filling with fresh snow. Maggie stood alone at the edge of the wilderness, the weight of her child and her bundle pulling at her tired arms, watching as her last connection to civilization abandoned her to die. But we won't die, she whispered to her unborn child, forcing her feet to move eastward. Not today. The snow was knee-deep in places, and Maggie's progress was agonizingly slow. Each step was a battle against exhaustion and the growing numbness in her fingers and toes. The wind cut through her clothing like knives, and the snow fell faster now, obscuring the trail Montgomery had pointed out. By mid-morning, she was lost, the landmarks around her buried under white, the stream he'd mentioned nowhere to be found. Her lungs burned with each breath of freezing air, and her legs trembled with fatigue. When she stumbled over a hidden root and fell heavily to her knees, the cry that escaped her lips was one of pure despair. She couldn't get up. The cold had seeped into her bones, and the small bundle of life within her seemed to be the only warmth left in her world. I'm sorry, she whispered, unsure if she was speaking to her unborn child or to Samuel's memory. I tried. As consciousness began to slip away, replaced by a strange, seductive warmth that promised peace, Maggie thought she heard something besides the wind. Footsteps, perhaps, crunching on snow. Or maybe it was just the beating of her own fading heart, counting down the moments until she and her child joined Samuel in whatever lay beyond. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was a figure moving through the swirling snow toward her, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs like some ancient forest spirit come to claim her soul. Consciousness returned to Maggie in fragments, the crackling of a fire, the smell of pine resin, the rough texture of animal furs against her cheek. For a moment, she thought perhaps she had died after all, and this was some strange afterlife. Then pain returned, The aching in her limbs, the soreness of her back, the lingering chill that seemed to have settled in her very bones. And she knew she was still very much alive. She opened her eyes to find herself in a small cabin, the interior illuminated by the amber glow of a hearth fire. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rough-hewn log walls were hung with cured animal pelts and bundles of dried herbs. A single window, covered with oiled paper instead of glass, let in weak daylight that suggested the storm still raged outside. Maggie tried to sit up and found herself wrapped in layers of blankets and furs. The movement drew attention from the far side of the cabin, where a man stood with his back to her, working at a crude wooden table. "Don't try to move too quick." The voice was deep, raspy, as if unused to speaking. "The cold got into you pretty." Good." He turned, and Maggie saw him clearly for the first time. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 50, with a face weathered by years of mountain sun and wind. A thick beard, more salt than pepper, covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes were surprisingly gentle beneath heavy brows. He wore buckskins and homespun wool, clothes made for durability rather than appearance. "Who are you?" Maggie managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Caleb Thornton." He approached slowly, as if afraid of frightening her, and knelt beside the pallet where she lay. His hands, she noticed, were large, but moved with surprising delicacy as he pressed one to her forehead. "Fever's down, that's good. How did you find me?" Caleb rose and moved to the fire, where a pot hung on an iron hook. "I know every inch of these mountains. Been tracking a buck when I crossed your trail. Weren't hard to follow, straight line from that wagon camp." He poured something steaming into a wooden cup. "They just leave you out there to die?" The bluntness of the question brought tears to Maggie's eyes. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Figured as much." He returned with the cup, helping her sit up enough to drink. The liquid was bitter but warming, some kind of herbal tea. "Seen it before. Hard times make for hard choices. Don't make it right." "The baby?" Maggie asked suddenly, her free hand flying to her belly. "Seems fine, strong heartbeat." At her surprised look, he added, "I was a doctor. Before." He didn't elaborate on what "before" meant, and Maggie didn't ask. There was time enough for stories. For now, she was safe, warm and alive, all things that had seemed impossible mere hours ago. "Rest now," Caleb said, taking the empty cup from her trembling hands. "Storms set in for at least a couple days, plenty of time to figure. What comes next?" Maggie nodded, suddenly exhausted despite having just woken. As she drifted back to sleep, the last thing she saw was Caleb returning to his table, hands moving methodically as he crushed dried leaves in a mortar, his movements speaking of years of practice. A doctor in the wilderness, a hermit who had saved her when all others had abandoned her. In her dreams, she wondered what forces had brought them together in this desolate, beautiful place. The next few days passed in a blur of sleep, warm broth, and gentle examinations. Caleb's hands were always professional, his manner brusque but kind, as he checked her for frostbite and made sure the baby continued to move and grow. He spoke little, answering direct questions, but offering nothing of himself voluntarily. By the fourth day, Maggie was strong enough to sit up properly and take in her surroundings. The cabin was small but efficiently organized. One corner held Caleb's sleeping area, a simple straw pallet covered with furs. Another contained stores of food, dried meat, preserved fruits, and sacks of beans and cornmeal. Herbs hung from the rafters and tools lined the walls. Knives, traps, a well-maintained rifle, and an assortment of medical instruments that seemed strangely out of place in this wilderness setting. Your medicine, Maggie said, watching as Caleb prepared a tea with careful measurements of different dried plants. It's not just frontier remedies, is it? He glanced at her, something flickering in his eyes. No. Trained at Harvard Medical School, in class of 32. The revelation hung in the air between them. What brought you here? So far from civilization? Caleb was quiet for so long that Maggie thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if the words came from somewhere deep inside him. War, death, my own failures. He handed her the cup of tea. Drink. It's good for the baby. Helps with the blood. She accepted it, watching him over the rim as she sipped. You were an army doctor. Seminole Wars, Florida. He moved to the window, looking out at the endless white. Saw things no man should see, did things no healer should do. Maggie waited, sensing there was more if she had the patience to hear it. Had a wife, Sarah, a daughter too, Emily. His hands tightened on the windowsill. Cholera took them both while I was away playing soldier. Came home to fresh graves and a house full of ghosts. I'm sorry, Maggie said softly. Caleb turned from the window. Your husband, Samuel. The name still hurt to say aloud. Consumption. 3 weeks ago, on the trail. The wagon master, the one who left you. He know you were with child. Ezekiel Montgomery. Even saying his name made her stomach clench with anger. Yes, that's why he left me. Said I was a burden. That one life, or two, wasn't worth risking 28 others. Caleb's expression darkened. Man like that's got no business leading others. He was chosen because he'd made the crossing before, Maggie said. Knew the trails, the dangers. People trusted him. Trust is easily given, easily betrayed. Caleb returned to his work table. Finish your tea. Then we should talk about what comes next. Next? Maggie hadn't thought beyond survival, beyond the immediate miracle of being found and saved. Winter's set in hard. No crossing the pass now until spring thaw, maybe April. Caleb spoke matter-of-factly. Baby's due when? February, Maggie replied, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. Mid-February, the midwife said. Caleb nodded, calculating. So you birth here, recover. Then when the pass is clear, you have choices to make. Choices? Stay in these mountains. Try to make it to California on your own, or head back east. He glanced at her. What was waiting for you in California? The question made Maggie realize how little she had considered. Her future beyond following Samuel's dream. Nothing now. Samuel had a cousin in Sacramento, Goldfields. We were going to start fresh. And before, back home? Nothing there either. She looked down at her hands. My parents died years ago. The farm was sold to pay debts. Samuel was all I had. Something in Caleb's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then you have time to decide. No rush. The days that followed established a rhythm to their shared existence. As Maggie regained her strength, she insisted on contributing to the household tasks, mending Caleb's worn clothing, organizing his haphazard stores, cooking meals from the provisions he had carefully accumulated for the winter. He spent most days outside, checking trap lines, hunting when the weather permitted, or simply disappearing into the forest for hours at a time. They spoke little during these early days, but the silence between them was companionable rather than strained. At night, as the wind howled around the cabin's sturdy walls, Caleb would sometimes read aloud from one of the few books he possessed. Medical texts mostly, but also a volume of Emerson's essays and a battered copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that surprised Maggie with its presence. It was during one such evening, nearly 2 weeks after her rescue, that Maggie finally found the courage to ask the question that had been growing in her mind. Why did you save me? She looked up from the shirt she was mending to find Caleb watching her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "You could have left me there. One more burden in a life already apart from others." Caleb was silent for a long moment, turning the question over like a stone in his palm. "I'm not Montgomery," he said finally. "I don't measure lives by their convenience, but you left civilization behind, chose solitude, not the same as choosing to let someone die." He set aside the traps he'd been repairing. "Besides, I'm a doctor, was a doctor. That oath doesn't wash away, even if the rest does." "Do no harm," Maggie murmured. "More than that, a positive duty to help when you can." He looked into the fire. "Failed that once. Won't do it again." The baby kicked then, a strong movement that made Maggie gasp softly. Without thinking, she reached for Caleb's hand and placed it on the spot. His eyes widened at the contact, but he didn't pull away as the child kicked again, a small foot or elbow pressing against his palm through the layers of skin and muscle. "Strong," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Healthy." "Because of you," Maggie replied softly. "We both are." Something shifted between them in that moment, a warming that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Caleb withdrew his hand slowly, almost reluctantly, and returned to his work. But Maggie had seen something in his eyes, a spark of connection that had perhaps been dormant since he had buried his family and fled to these mountains. As December deepened into January, the snow outside the cabin door grew higher, and the cold became a living thing that pressed against the walls and slithered through every crack. Caleb went out less frequently now, using the time to teach Maggie about the herbs he had collected during the warmer months, showing her how to prepare tinctures and poultices that would be needed when her time came. "You know about birthing?" she asked one afternoon as they worked side by side, crushing dried raspberry leaves for tea. "Delivered my share," Caleb replied, his hands never pausing in their steady rhythm. "Not my specialty, but medicine gets simpler up here. You learn what's needed. And if something goes wrong," the fear that had been her constant companion since Samuel's death resurfaced. If we, nothing's going to go wrong." Caleb's voice was firm. "You're young, strong, baby's positioned right. Everything I've seen tells me this will be a normal birth." Maggie wanted to believe him, but the wilderness had already taken so much from her. "Samuel promised we'd be in California before the baby came. A proper town with a proper doctor." Caleb's hands stilled. "You have a proper doctor." "I didn't mean..." "I know what you meant." He wasn't angry, just matter of fact. "But trust me, when I say you're safer here than you would have been in some mining camp with a sawbones who learned his craft amputating limbs in the Mexican War." The fierceness of his conviction surprised her. "You really believe that?" "I do." He met her gaze directly. "I won't let anything happen to you or your child, Maggie. Not while I have breath in my body." The promise hung between them, weighted with a significance neither was ready to examine too closely. But that night, when the cold was at its most bitter and the wind shrieked like a wounded animal around the cabin, Maggie slept more soundly than she had since Samuel first coughed blood onto their bedsheets. January brought with it storms that seemed determined to bury the small cabin entirely. Caleb spent hours each day clearing paths to the woodpile and the small lean-to where he kept his tools and traps. The physical labor seemed to settle something in him, and he began to speak more freely during the long evenings, sharing stories of his life before, his childhood in Boston, his years at medical school, even carefully edited tales of his time as a military surgeon, In turn, Maggie told him about her own life, growing up on a small farm in Pennsylvania, meeting Samuel at a church social, their dreams of California, and the better life they had planned to build there. Speaking of Samuel became easier, the sharp pain of loss gradually mellowing into a gentler sadness. She would always love him, always mourn what might have been, but the need to survive, to create a future for their child, had begun to overshadow grief's paralyzing grip. As her body changed, growing heavier with the child that would soon enter the world, Caleb's care became more intentional. He insisted she walk daily, even if only the small circuit of the cabin's interior. He prepared special foods rich in iron and other nutrients, drawing on knowledge that seemed to span both his formal medical training and wisdom gleaned from years in the mountains. "Where did you learn about these plants?" Maggie asked one evening as he prepared a tea of nettle and red clover. "This isn't from your Harvard training." A rare smile crossed Caleb's face, softening the weathered lines around his eyes. "No, that came later. There was an old Shoshone woman, Singing Bird they called her in English, found me my first winter here, half dead from cold and stupidity, much like I found you." Maggie smiled at the comparison. "And she taught you her medicines?" "Some. Enough to survive. Enough to help others sometimes." He handed her the cup. "The Shoshone have delivered babies for centuries without Harvard Medical School. Their wisdom has value." The admission from a formally trained physician surprised her. Samuel would say that's superstition, not science. Samuel wasn't a doctor. There was no judgment in Caleb's voice, just certainty. Medicine isn't just about knowing the human body. It's about knowing the earth that sustains it, the plants that heal it, the spirit that animates it. "You sound more philosopher than physician," Maggie observed, sipping the bitter tea. "Maybe that's what these mountains do to a man." Caleb looked toward the window, where frost had etched intricate patterns on the oiled paper. "Strip away the unnecessary, leave only what matters." "And what matters, Dr. Thornton?" The formal address was gently teasing. She hadn't called him that before. His eyes, when they met hers, were clear and direct. Life, compassion, doing. Right by those who need you, not much else. Simple principles for a complicated world. As Maggie finished her tea in comfortable silence, she wondered if perhaps the wisdom of these mountains had been what she needed all along. Not the glitter of California gold, but the quiet strength of survival in the face of nature's harshest challenges. February arrived with a brief thaw that quickly refroze, coating the world outside in a glittering sheath of ice that transformed the forest into a crystal palace. Maggie's time grew closer, her body preparing for the work ahead. The baby had dropped lower, making breathing easier, but walking more difficult. Caleb watched her with a physician's careful eye, noting changes in her complexion, her energy, the swelling in her ankles and hands. "Any day now," he said one morning as he helped her to her feet after examining her. "The baby's head is engaged, your body's ready." Fear and anticipation warred within her. "I wish my mother were here," she admitted softly. "Or Samuel." Caleb's hand lingered on her arm, steadying her. "I know, but you're not alone, Maggie. Not anymore." The simple truth of those words brought tears to her eyes. From abandonment to belonging in the span of 2 months, a journey as transformative as the one that had brought her to these mountains in the first place. Her labor began. That night, gentle at first, twinges that woke her from sleep coming and going like waves on a distant shore. By morning, there was no mistaking what was happening. Caleb transformed before her eyes, the quiet mountain man replaced by the confident physician. He moved with purpose, preparing clean linens, heating water, arranging his supplies with methodical precision. "Remember to breathe," he instructed as the pains intensified. "Work with your body, not against it." Hours passed in a blur of pain and determination. Maggie lost track of time, aware only of the rhythmic contractions that demanded everything of her and Caleb's steady presence, his voice a constant anchor in the storm of sensation. He spoke little now, but his hands were sure as they supported her, checked the baby's position, wiped the sweat from her brow. As the winter sun began to set, painting the ice-covered world outside in shades of gold and pink, Maggie's labor reached its crescendo, with a final, primal cry that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. She pushed her child into Caleb's waiting hands. "A girl," he announced, his voice thick with emotion as he laid the squirming, red-faced infant on Maggie's chest. Perfect and strong. Maggie gazed down at her daughter through tears of exhaustion and joy. Tiny fists waved in protest at the cold world, and a lusty cry filled the cabin, the sound of new life, of possibilities not yet imagined. "Hello, little one," she whispered, counting fingers and toes by instinct, marveling at the miracle she had carried within her for so long. "Welcome to the world." Caleb moved efficiently around them, completing the necessary tasks with practiced ease, but his eyes kept returning to the tableau of mother and child. When at last everything was settled, the afterbirth delivered, the baby swaddled, Maggie made comfortable with fresh linens, he sat heavily on a stool beside them, looking suddenly older in the flickering firelight. "She needs a name," he said, softly. Maggie studied her daughter's face, already seeing echoes of Samuel in the shape of her nose, the curve of her brow. But there was something else there too, a determination, a fierceness that spoke of survival against all odds. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name is Hope." Caleb nodded, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "It suits her." In the days that followed, the small cabin took on a new rhythm centered around Hope's needs and Maggie's recovery. Caleb revealed yet another side of himself, a gentleness with the infant that spoke of the father he had once been. He showed Maggie how to swaddle properly, how to ease colic with gentle pressure, how to recognize the different cries that signaled hunger, discomfort, or simple desire for contact. 2 weeks after Hope's birth, as Maggie sat by the fire nursing, her daughter Caleb approached with something clutched in his hand. "Made this," he said gruffly, holding out a small wooden carving, "for the little one." It was a bear, expertly carved from pine, smooth and perfect for small hands to grasp when the time came. The detail was exquisite, the curve of the animals, back the suggestion of fur, the watchful eyes that seemed almost alive. "It's beautiful," Maggie whispered, deeply touched by the gift. "I didn't know you could carve like this." "Something to do during the long winters," he shrugged, embarrassed by her praise. "Made them for Emily once." The admission, so casual, yet so profound, made Maggie's heart ache for the man who had saved them. "She would be proud of you, Caleb, your daughter, your wife too." He looked away, but not before she saw the moisture in his eyes. "Maybe. Been a long road since then." "For all of us," Maggie agreed, looking down at Hope's peaceful face as she nursed. "But perhaps that's what brings us where we need to be." As February gave way to March, the first real signs of spring began to appear. Longer days, the occasional birdsong, patches of ground emerging from beneath the melting snow. With the changing season came the knowledge that decisions could no longer be postponed. The passes would clear soon, and the world beyond their sheltered valley would once again be accessible. "What will you do?" Caleb asked one evening as they sat together watching Hope sleep in the cradle he had fashioned from half a hollowed log. "When the snow melts." The question had been hovering between them for weeks, unasked but ever present. Maggie had turned it over in her mind countless times, weighing options, considering futures she had never imagined before the wagon train left her behind. I don't know, she admitted. California seems less important now, just a place Samuel wanted to go. And back east, nothing for us there. She looked at Hope, at the small fists curled beneath her chin. No family, no home. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the hearth. When he finally spoke, his voice was hesitant, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep within him. You could stay. He didn't look at her. Here, with me. The simple offer hung in the air between them, weighted with everything unsaid. Maggie studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw beneath the beard, the intelligence in his brow, the hint of vulnerability in the set of his shoulders. As what, Caleb? She asked softly. Your housekeeper? Your patient? Now he did look at her, his eyes clear and direct. As whatever you want to be. Whatever we become to each other. No demands, no expectations, just a choice. A door left, open. It wasn't a declaration of love. They weren't ready for that, might never be. But it was an offering of possibility, of a future neither of them had imagined when the winter began. The town, Silverpine, it's growing, he continued. When she didn't immediately respond, 15 families now, a proper settlement. They've asked me to be their doctor, set up a proper practice. You've been to the town. When? Last week, when I checked the trap lines. At her surprised look, he added, didn't want to say anything until I was sure, until I knew what I could offer you, both of you. The thought of Caleb making plans, considering their future while she recovered from childbirth, touched something deep within Maggie. He had said nothing, promised nothing, until he was certain he could make good on those promises. A house? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A proper house, not just a cabin. Lands staked, materials ordered. The men of the town will help build it come spring. A hint of pride crept into his voice. 2 stories, proper glass windows, space for a surgery downstairs, living quarters above. A garden plot for your herbs and vegetables. My herbs? You have a gift for healing, Maggie, I've seen it. The way you prepare the medicines, how you understand what each plant does. He leaned forward, earnestness breaking through his usual reserve. We could work together, doctor and whatever title you want. Partner, healer in your own right. The vision he painted was seductive in its simplicity and its rightness. Not a replacement for the life she had lost, but something new. Something that honored who she had become through loss and survival. And Hope, she asked, glancing at their sleeping daughter, would have a father who would love her as his own. The words were simple, direct, like everything about Caleb. If you'd allow it. Tears welled in Maggie's eyes, not of grief this time, but of possibility, of doors opening rather than closing. I need time, she said finally, to be sure, for both our sakes. Caleb nodded, accepting her caution without resentment. Spring won't come for weeks yet, no rush to decide. But as Maggie lay awake that night, listening to Hope's soft breathing and the familiar sounds of the cabin settling in the cold, she realized that her decision had already been made. Not in this moment of explicit offering, but in all the small moments that had preceded it, in the trust that had grown between them, in the respect that had deepened into affection, in the shared purpose of bringing Hope safely into the world. The wagon train had abandoned her to die, but in doing so, had delivered her exactly where she needed to be. The path ahead would not be easy. Life in these mountains never was, but it would be honest, real, chosen rather than forced upon her by circumstance or others' decisions. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the first subtle hint of warming, air from the south. Maggie smiled in the darkness, her hand finding Hope's cradle, rocking it gently. Spring was coming, bringing with it new life, new beginnings, new hope. And this time, she would meet it on her own terms, not as cargo to be discarded when inconvenient, but as a woman who had faced the wilderness and found within it not just survival, but the promise of something far richer. The cabin transformed. With Hope's arrival, what had been a simple shelter, a place of necessity rather than attachment, became something Caleb had not known in years, a home. The child's cries and coos filled spaces long hollowed by silence, and Maggie's gentle presence softened the rough edges of his solitary existence. Even the light seemed different now, as if the sun itself took greater interest in the life unfolding. Within these wooden walls, Caleb found himself watching them often, the way Maggie's face lit up when Hope nursed successfully, the tender way she traced the curve of the infant's cheek, the songs she hummed while rocking her to sleep. These simple moments awakened something he had long thought dead, buried in the same distant grave as Sarah and Emily. He was careful to keep his distance, to respect the boundaries of their arrangement, but his thoughts increasingly strayed to the future, to what might be possible when spring came. Maggie noticed the change in him. How could she not? The man who had pulled her from the snow had been withdrawn, efficient in his care, but guarded in his manner. This new Caleb smiled more readily, spoke more easily, and seemed more present in each moment. She caught him carving new toys for Hope late into the evening, a deer, a rabbit, a squirrel to join the bear he had already gifted. His hands, so large and weathered, worked the wood with surprising gentleness, the same care evident when he examined Hope during her weekly checks. "She's gaining weight nicely," he announced one morning in late March as he weighed the infant in a makeshift scale fashioned from buckskin and cord. "Strong lungs, good color. You're doing everything right, Maggie." "We both are," she replied, watching as he wrapped Hope back in her blanket with practiced ease. "I couldn't have done this without you, Caleb." He handed the baby back to her, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "You're stronger than you know. You'd have found a way. Is that what drew you to these mountains? Strength?" The question caught him off guard, and he busied himself with putting away his instruments before answering. "Not strength. Escape. Maybe. Punishment, certainly." "Punishment?" Maggie settled Hope against her shoulder, patting the small back gently. "For what?" Caleb sat heavily on the stool beside the fire, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "For not being there when they needed me, Sarah, Emily, for choosing duty to strangers over family." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with years of self-recrimination. Maggie waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. "I was the regiment's surgeon," he continued, his voice low. "When cholera broke out in Boston, Sarah wrote to me, begged me to come home to help them. But there were men under my care, soldiers with wounds that would fester without attention. I told myself they needed me more, that I'd come as soon as I could." He looked up then, meeting Maggie's eyes with a gaze that carried the weight of an old, familiar pain. "By the time I arrived, they were both gone, 3 days in the ground. And all I could think was that if I'd been there, if I'd chosen them, I might have saved them." "You don't know that," Maggie said softly, understanding the torment of what-ifs that haunted sleepless nights. "Cholera takes the strongest among us. You might have lost them anyway. Maybe, but I'd have been there." His hands tightened on his knees. "Not miles away, cutting bullets out of men who'd live or die regardless of my skill." Hope made a small sound against Maggie's shoulder, drawing both their attention. The simple presence of the child, this new life that had come into being, against such odds, seemed to put Caleb's confession into perspective. "We can't change the past," Maggie said, her voice gentle but firm. "Samuel used to say that regret is just fear facing backward, that the only direction worth looking is ahead." "Your husband sounds like he was a wise man." Sometimes a small smile touched her lips. Other times he was stubborn and impractical. But he was right about that, I think. We have to live with our choices, learn from them, but not let them imprison us. Caleb considered her words, his expression thoughtful. And what would Samuel think about you staying here with me? The directness of the question startled her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Caleb had never been one to dance around difficult subjects. I think, she said slowly, that he would want Hope and me to be safe, to be part of something real. She shifted the baby in her arms, looking down at the now sleeping face. Samuel loved grand dreams, California, gold, fortune. But what I needed, what we need, is something solid, something true. The look that passed between them carried understanding beyond words. In this wilderness, stripped of society's expectations and pretenses, they had found something neither had expected, a second chance at connection, at purpose, at building rather than merely surviving. April brought rapid changes to the mountain landscape. Snow retreated up the slopes, revealing patches of earth that quickly greened with new growth. The stream that had been frozen solid all winter now gurgled with frigid meltwater, carrying winter's remnants down to the valley below. Birds returned, their songs filling the dawn with complex melodies that had been absent for months. Caleb began making more frequent trips to Silver Pine, returning with supplies and news. The settlement was indeed growing. The discovery of a new silver vein had drawn prospectors and the businesses that catered to them. Plans for a proper schoolhouse were underway, and talk of bringing in a preacher from Denver circulated among the families seeking to establish civilization in this remote corner of the territories. They've started clearing the land for our house, he reported one evening, unlacing his boots by the door after a day's journey. Foundation stones are being gathered, timbers cut and seasoning. Maggie looked up from where she sat, nursing Hope by the fire. Our house, she repeated, testing the phrase. You still think of it that way, even though I haven't given you an answer? Caleb set his boots aside and crossed to the simple table where a pot of stew simmered. Hope makes it worth building either way, he said, ladling the food into a wooden bowl. If you choose to go, the town still needs a doctor with proper quarters. If you stay... He glanced at her, something vulnerable in his expression. Well, it would be good to have the space. The practical approach to such a deeply personal matter was so typically Caleb that Maggie couldn't help but smile. He built what was needed, prepared for all possibilities, and waited for life to reveal which path would open. I've been thinking, she said, shifting Hope to her other breast, about what you said, working together, using what I know about herbs and healing. Caleb paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. And I'd like to learn more, to be useful, not just... She hesitated, searching for the right words. Not just someone you rescued, someone with her own purpose. You've never been just anything, Maggie, he replied, his voice gruff with emotion he rarely displayed. Not to me. The admission, simple as it was, wrapped around her heart like a warming flame. This taciturn man who measured his words as carefully as he measured his medicines had given her something precious, recognition of her value beyond gratitude or obligation. That night, as Hope slept soundly in her cradle, Maggie lay awake listening to Caleb's steady breathing from his pallet across the cabin. The distance between them, just a few feet of wooden floor, seemed suddenly arbitrary, a boundary maintained out of habit rather than necessity. They had shared this small space through the deepest winter, through the birth of her child, through confessions that laid bare their deepest wounds. Yet this final step, this deliberate closing of physical space, remained untaken. Perhaps she thought it was better this way, to build slowly, to be certain. to honor the past while creating something new, something that belonged only to them. The following weeks brought increasingly frequent trips to Silverpine. Caleb would leave at dawn and return by dusk, his clothes bearing the scent of sawdust and pine sap from overseeing the construction of their new home. Occasionally, he would bring visitors, Mrs. Patterson, the midwife who was eager to meet Maggie and see the baby she'd heard so much about. James Colton, the storekeeper who kept setting aside fabric and household goods he thought might interest the doctor's woman, as Maggie had apparently become known. "They're curious about you," Caleb explained after one such visit. "A woman, surviving what you did. It's become something of a legend in town." Maggie, who had been washing the cups used by their guests, looked up in surprise. "A legend? Me? The pregnant widow abandoned in the blizzard? The mountain hermit who tracked her through the storm?" A rare smile touched his lips. "Makes for a good story around the evening fire. And what do they say about us, living here together all these months?" Caleb's expression grew more serious. "Some talk, of course. Always do. But most understand that life in these mountains makes its own rules. Survival matters more than propriety." Maggie nodded, understanding the delicate position they occupied. In civilization, a widow living unchaperoned with a bachelor, regardless of his profession or the circumstances, would be cause for scandal. Here, the mere fact of their continued existence overrode such concerns. "And when we move to town," she asked, "will those rules change?" "Some will expect it to." He crossed to where she stood, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Which is why I wanted to ask you something." Her heart quickened at his proximity, at the intentness in his gaze. "Yes?" "The preacher's coming through next month, circuit rider from Denver." Caleb's voice was steady, but she could see the pulse jumping in his throat. "I thought, if you were willing, he might marry us before we moved to town." Though she had sensed this was coming, had perhaps even hoped for it, the actual proposal still took her breath away. Not for its romance. Caleb was not a man of flowery declarations, but for its honesty, its rightness. "As a convenience?" she asked, needing to be sure. "For propriety's sake?" "No." His hands, always so sure in their work, fidgeted slightly before settling on her shoulders. "Because I care for you, Maggie. For hope. Because what started as duty has become more. Much more." It wasn't a passionate declaration of undying love, but it was true, real, as solid as the mountains that had brought them together. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll marry you, Caleb." The smile that transformed his face then was like sunrise breaking over the peaks, sudden, brilliant, illuminating. Without hesitation, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, a kiss that carried the promise of all the words neither of them quite knew how to say. Hope chose that moment to wake, her hungry cry interrupting the tender moment. Maggie pulled back, laughing softly as reality reasserted itself. "She has perfect timing," Caleb said, his eyes still holding hers. "She's been teaching us that since she arrived," Maggie agreed, moving to lift the baby from her cradle. "Life doesn't wait for perfect moments. It creates them in the midst of everything else." As May unfurled its green banners across the mountainsides, preparations for both the wedding and the move intensified. Caleb spent more time in Silverpine, returning with increasingly detailed reports on the house's progress. 2 bedrooms upstairs, one for them, one for Hope. A large front room downstairs that would serve as Caleb's surgery, with a separate entrance for patients. A proper kitchen with an iron stove rather than just a hearth. Glass windows that would let in light while keeping out the winter cold. "Mrs. Patterson has organized the women to make curtains," he reported one evening, "and Colton's wife is determined to host a gathering after the ceremony." A proper welcome, she calls it. Maggie, who had been nervous about how the town would receive her, this stranger with a child born in the wilderness, felt a wave of relief. They're being very kind. They're curious, Caleb corrected, though without malice, and grateful. The idea of having a real doctor, two healers, once they understand what you know about herbal medicine, has given them hope for the future of their settlement. The mention of her knowledge gave Maggie pause. Do you really think they'll accept me working alongside you? A woman with no formal training? Caleb looked at her with genuine surprise. Your hands have prepared half the medicines I've used. This winter, you have an instinct for healing that can't be taught in any medical school. He gestured to the neat bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the jars of tinctures and salves that lined the shelves, all organized and mostly prepared by Maggie over the past months. Besides, frontier medicine needs practical knowledge more than Latin terminology. His confidence in her abilities warmed something deep within Maggie. Samuel had loved her, had cherished her as his wife, but he had never truly seen her potential beyond the conventional roles of wife and mother. Caleb saw more, saw possibilities she herself was only beginning to recognize. The day before they were to travel to Silverpine for the wedding, Maggie went through the few possessions she had carried from the wagon train. Samuel's pocket watch. She would give it to Hope when she was older. The small book of pressed flowers from her Pennsylvania home, the wedding ring she had removed after his death. She held the simple gold band in her palm, feeling its weight and the memories it carried. Her marriage to Samuel had been happy, if brief. She had loved him truly, had built dreams on the foundation of that love. Now she was preparing to make new vows, to forge a different kind of partnership with a man she had known barely 5 months. Yet those months contained more raw truth, more stripped bare humanity than many couples might share in years of conventional courtship. She and Caleb had seen each other at their most vulnerable, she in the throes of childbirth, he in the confession of his deepest regrets. They had built trust not through social niceties, but through the fundamental acts of survival and care. With a sense of completion rather than betrayal, Maggie wrapped Samuel's ring in a small piece of cloth and tucked it into her suitcase, beside the book of flowers. It was part of her history, part of Hope's heritage, but it would not be part of her future. That future awaited in Silverpine, in the house being built on the edge of a growing settlement, in the life she and Caleb would forge together. The journey to town the next day took most of the morning. Though the main pass remained snow-covered, the lower trail had cleared enough for safe travel. Caleb had borrowed a mule and cart from James Colton, making the trip easier for Maggie and Hope than it would have been on foot. As they crested the final rise, Silverpine came into view, a collection of wooden buildings and tents nestled in a protected valley. A creek ran through its center, and surrounding hills showed the scars of mining operations. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from this distance, Maggie could see people moving about the single main street that formed the settlement's heart. "It's larger than I expected," she said, adjusting Hope in her arms. The baby, now 3 months old, was alert and curious, her eyes taking in the changing scenery with apparent fascination. 15 families when I first mentioned it," Caleb replied, guiding the mule carefully down the slope. 22 now. Word of the silver strike is spreading. By summer's end, they're expecting the population to double again. The thought of so many people after months of isolation was both exciting and intimidating. Maggie had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of life in the cabin, to days marked only by Hope's needs and the natural cycles of the mountain. Now, she would be thrust into a community with expectations, judgments, and complexities beyond the straightforward challenges of survival. As they entered the town proper, heads turned and conversations paused. Maggie felt the weight of curious stares, heard the murmurs that followed their passage. Whether they were judging or merely interested, she couldn't tell. But she straightened her back and lifted her chin, determined to meet this new challenge with the same courage that had carried her through everything else. They stopped first at the store, where James Colton and his plump, cheerful wife welcomed them effusively. Mrs. Colton immediately took to Hope, cooing over the baby, while Mr. Colton clapped Caleb on the shoulder with obvious affection. "The preacher arrived yesterday," he informed them. "Staying with the Pattersons, says he can perform the ceremony tomorrow morning before heading on to Crestview. And your house is coming along beautifully," Mrs. Colton added, bouncing Hope gently in her arms. "The men finished the roof yesterday. Windows are in. It still needs some finishing work inside, but it's dry and sound. You can stay with us tonight." Of course. The casual acceptance, the practical arrangements, all of it spoke of a community that had already folded Caleb and, by extension, Maggie, into its fabric. Whether out of need for their medical skills or genuine welcome, the result was the same. They belonged here. That evening, after a simple but hearty meal at the Coltons' table, Maggie found herself alone with Mrs. Colton, while the men stepped outside to smoke pipes and discuss the town's latest developments. Hope slept peacefully in a borrowed cradle, exhausted from the excitement of the day. "He's different since he found you," Mrs. Colton said abruptly, her hands busy with mending as they sat beside the fire. "Caleb, more present. Before, he was like a ghost himself, haunting these mountains rather than living in them." Maggie looked up from the dress she was smoothing, a gift from Mrs. Colton for the wedding tomorrow, hastily altered to fit her still recovering figure. "You've known him long?" 3 years, since the first family settled here." Mrs. Colton set her sewing aside, fixing Maggie with a direct gaze. "He'd come down from his cabin every few months, trade furs for supplies, treat the occasional broken, bone or fever, but he never stayed, never connected, just drifted in and out like a shadow." The description fit with what Caleb had told her of his life after losing his family, the deliberate isolation, the self-imposed exile from human attachment. And now he's building a house, making plans, getting married. A smile softened Mrs. Colton's round face. "Whatever happened between you two up in that cabin all winter, it brought him back to the land of the living. That's a powerful thing, Maggie Wilson." The simple observation carried more truth than any flowery romantic notion could have. What had grown between her and Caleb wasn't the passionate whirlwind of young love, but something steadier, deeper, a mutual recognition of brokenness and the possibility of healing through purpose and connection. "I think," Maggie said slowly, "we saved each other." Mrs. Colton nodded, satisfied with the answer. "Best kind of marriage there is, equal ground, both giving, both receiving." She picked up her mending again. "Too many folks think love is all, about pretty words and grand gestures. Real love is in the quiet moments, the hard choices, the daily bread of life shared willingly. Wisdom from an unexpected source, but wisdom nonetheless." As Maggie prepared for bed that night in the Coltons' spare room, Hope sleeping beside her, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the desperate young widow abandoned, in the snow, to the woman who would tomorrow become a wife again, a healer in her own right, part of a community that needed what she could offer. The wedding itself was simple, held in the town's newly constructed meeting hall that served as church, courthouse, and gathering place. The circuit-riding preacher, a thin man with kind eyes and a practical manner, performed the ceremony with efficiency born of years traveling between remote settlements where time was precious and work always waiting. Maggie wore the dress Mrs. Colton had given her, a deep blue calico that complemented her fair complexion. Hope, dressed in a white gown sewn by several of the town's women, slept in Mrs. Patterson's arms throughout the brief service. Caleb, stood tall and straight in a clean shirt and his best buckskins, his beard trimmed neatly for the occasion, his eyes never leaving Maggie's face as they spoke their vows. "I take you, Margaret Wilson, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the hushed room. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." Simple words, ancient in their formulation, yet made new by the specific journey that had brought them to this moment. When Maggie repeated her own vows, her voice was clear and steady, free of the doubt that might have plagued a decision made under less extraordinary circumstances. The gathering that followed was lively despite its modest scale. The entire settlement turned out to welcome Mrs. Thornton, as Maggie was now called, and to celebrate having secured a permanent doctor for their growing community. Children played underfoot, miners and shopkeepers mingled freely, and the air hummed with the optimism of a frontier town on the cusp of prosperity. Amidst the celebration, Caleb took Maggie's hand and led her outside, where the spring air was cool and fragrant with pine. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and deep rose. "I want to show you something," he said, guiding her toward the edge of town where new construction was underway. They walked past several recently built cabins, more substantial than the tents and temporary structures that had marked Silverpine's earliest days. At the very edge of the settlement, set slightly apart on a gentle rise, stood their new home. Even in the fading light, Maggie could see that it was everything Caleb had described and more. 2 stories tall, built of sturdy pine logs with a proper shingled roof. Glass windows reflected the sunset, and a wide porch wrapped around the front, and one side, a stone chimney promised warmth in the winter months to come. "It's beautiful," she breathed, taking in the sight of this tangible proof of their new beginning. "Not finished inside," Caleb cautioned. "Another week or 2 for that. But I wanted you to see it today, as Mrs. Thornton." The name still felt new on her ears, but not unwelcome. Like the house before them, it represented not a replacement for what had been lost, but something new built on a foundation of shared experience and mutual respect. "Can we go inside?" she asked. Caleb nodded, producing a key from his pocket. "It's yours as much as mine. Every decision from here on is ours together." The interior was indeed unfinished. Bare wooden floors, walls that needed chinking, spaces where furniture would eventually stand. But Maggie could see the bones of it, the careful planning that had gone into its design. The large front room, with separate entrance for patients, the functional kitchen with space for her herbal preparations, the staircase leading to the rooms above. "Our bedroom faces east," Caleb said, leading her up the stairs. "You'll have sunrise through that window every morning." The thoughtfulness of this detail, remembering how she had once mentioned loving the first light of day, touched Maggie deeply. This man, so often sparing with words, spoke volumes through such considerations. In the half-built room that would soon be their private sanctuary, Caleb turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. In the golden light of sunset, streaming through the unfinished window, his face was open, vulnerable in a way she had rarely seen. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said softly. "A home, a family, purpose beyond mere survival." "Nor I," Maggie admitted. "After Samuel died, I couldn't see beyond the next hour, the next day, just putting one foot in front of the other. And now?" She smiled, feeling the truth of her words as she spoke them. "Now I see a future, our future, here, in this house, in this town, healing what can be healed, building what can be built, raising hope to be strong and compassionate." Caleb's hands tightened around hers. "I can't promise it will always be easy. The winters are hard here, the work never ends. But I can promise you'll never face it alone, not ever again. In that moment, standing in the shell of what would become their home, Maggie felt something settle within her, a certainty that had been growing since that first night in Caleb's cabin when he had offered shelter without expectation. This was right. This was where she belonged. Not because circumstances had forced her here, but because choice, deliberate, clear-eyed choice, had led her to this man, this place, this life. As the light faded from the sky and night claimed the mountains once more, Maggie and Caleb sealed their new beginning with a kiss that carried all the promise of spring after the longest winter, rebirth, renewal, and the quiet courage to begin again. Summer unfurled across the mountains with a vigor that matched the growth of silver pine itself. New buildings sprouted along the widening main street, and the sound of hammers and saws formed a constant backdrop to daily life. Wagons arrived weekly now that the pass was clear, bringing supplies, prospectors, and families seeking their fortunes in the silver-rich hills. At the edge of this burgeoning activity, the Thornton house became a center of its own kind of commerce, not in silver or goods, but in healing and care. The front surgery room, finally completed with proper cabinets for medicines and an examination table Caleb had built himself, saw a steady stream of patients. Miners with crushed fingers and broken bones, children with fevers and rashes, women seeking advice on pregnancies or relief from various ailments. Maggie found her place in this work with surprising ease. While Caleb handled the more serious injuries and illnesses, she became known for her gentle touch with children and her growing expertise with herbal remedies. The garden behind their house expanded weekly as she cultivated plants both familiar and new, learning their properties through books Caleb ordered from Denver and through the practical wisdom shared by the women of the town. Mrs. Thornton's, "A tea fixed my Tommy's cough when nothing else would," Maggie overheard one mother telling another as they passed on the street. The simple statement filled her with a quiet pride that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with purpose, found and fulfilled. Hope thrived in this environment, growing from the tiny infant of their isolated winter into a curious, sturdy baby who charmed everyone she met. At 6 months, she was already showing signs of a determined personality, reaching for objects with single-minded focus and protesting loudly when thwarted. Her dark hair and blue eyes, so like Samuel's, were complemented by an expressive face that seemed capable of communicating a full range of emotions without words. "She's going to be a handful," Mrs. Patterson predicted, after witnessing one of Hope's more impressive displays of displeasure when a colorful ribbon was placed beyond her reach. "Spirited, this one." "Like her mother," Caleb replied with a rare smile, his eyes meeting Maggie's across the room. The warmth in his gaze still had the power to catch her off guard, to remind her how far they had come from those first cautious days in his cabin. Their marriage had evolved with the same steady, undramatic progress as the seasons. The initial hesitancy, two people learning each other's rhythms and boundaries, gradually gave way to a comfortable intimacy. Caleb was not a demonstrative man by nature, but Maggie came to recognize the depth of his feeling in 1,000 small gestures. The coffee prepared exactly as she liked it before she came downstairs each morning. The fresh wildflowers that appeared on her work table when he returned from checking on remote patients. The way his hand inevitably found the small of her back when they stood side by side. In their private moments, they discovered a passion neither had anticipated. A meeting of bodies that matched the meeting of minds and purposes that had drawn them together. If Maggie sometimes woke from dreams of Samuel, confused momentarily by the different contours of the man who now shared her bed, she did not consider it disloyalty, but rather the complex reality of a heart that had loved, lost, and found the courage to love again. July brought a heat wave that settled over the valley like a wool blanket, driving the miners to work shorter shifts and sending children to splash in the creek that ran through town. The Thorntons' house, positioned to catch mountain breezes, remained relatively comfortable, but the surgery room saw an increase in cases of heat exhaustion and sunstroke. "Third one today," Caleb muttered as he helped a young miner into a chair, the man's face alarmingly red beneath his tan. "Nobody listens when I tell them to wear hats and take more water up to the diggings." "The silver won't wait, Doc," the miner replied weakly. "Every day not working is money lost." "Can't spend money if you're dead," Caleb replied bluntly, nodding to Maggie, who was already preparing a cooling draught of mint and willow bark. She administered the medicine while Caleb checked the man's pulse and breathing, their movements around each other so synchronized now that they rarely needed words to communicate during treatments. When the miner had recovered enough to leave, walking away with strict instructions to rest for the remainder of the day, Caleb turned to Maggie with a sigh. "This heat's going to cause more trouble before it breaks," he predicted, wiping sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. "The creek's running lower every day. If it dries up completely..." He didn't need to finish the thought. Water was life in these mountains, especially during a mining boom when hundreds of people and animals depended on a steady supply. Already, arguments had broken out over access to the diminishing creek, with upstream users accused of taking more than their share. "Could rain come soon?" Maggie asked, glancing out the window at the cloudless blue sky. "Should. Usually does by August." Caleb frowned slightly. "But nothing's guaranteed up here. I've seen summers so dry that forest fires swept whole valleys clean." The very next day, his words proved prophetic. Maggie was in the garden, Hope playing on a blanket beside her, when she noticed a strange quality to the light. Looking up, she saw a haze along the western ridge that hadn't been there an hour before, a smudge of grey against the blue that turned the sunlight an eerie yellow. By evening, there was no doubt. Fire had come to the mountains. The smell of smoke hung in the air, and ash drifted down like tainted snow. From their porch, they could see the distant glow beyond the western peaks, a malevolent sunset that didn't fade with night. "How far?" Maggie asked, standing beside Caleb as they watched the distant flames painting the undersides of clouds with orange light. 10 miles, maybe 12. He put an arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. "The valley between should stop it from reaching us directly, but the smoke..." The smoke indeed became their most immediate concern. By morning, it had settled into Silverpine like a physical presence, irritating eyes and throats, forcing doors and windows closed despite the heat. Caleb and Maggie found themselves treating a constant stream of patients with breathing difficulties, particularly the elderly and the very young. "Keep a wet cloth over your face when you go outside," became their refrain as they dispensed teas for sore throats and salves for irritated eyes. "Stay indoors as much as possible. Keep water nearby for drinking and dampening cloths." But as the days passed and the fire spread along the ridgelines surrounding the valley, a new problem emerged. Panic. Rumors flew through town faster than the flames through the drought-dry forest. The fire had jumped the valley. The water supply would be cut off. The only road out would soon be blocked. "We need to leave," argued Hansen, the saloon owner, at an impromptu town meeting held in the stifling confines of the meeting hall. "Pack what we can and head east before it's too late." "And go where?" countered Mrs. Patterson. "The nearest. Settlement is 4 days' journey, with women, children, the elderly. In this heat with this smoke, better than burning alive." The debate grew heated, voices rising as fear found its expression in anger. Maggie, seated beside Caleb, with Hope fussing in her arms, watched the community that had welcomed them, so warmly fracturing under the pressure of a threat they couldn't fight or control. Finally, Caleb stood. Unlike some of the more vocal men in town, he rarely spoke at such gatherings, preferring to offer his opinion privately or when directly asked. His rising now caused an immediate hush to fall over the crowd. "I've seen forest fires before," he said, his deep voice carrying easily in the sudden quiet. "Fought them, treated those who fought them. This one's big, but it's behaving predictably. Following the pines stands along the ridges where the fuel is densest. The natural firebreak of the valley is holding. For now," someone muttered. Caleb acknowledged this with a nod. "For now, and we should be prepared if that changes. But a panic-driven exodus could kill more people than staying put sensibly." "What do you suggest, Doc?" James Colton asked, wiping sweat from his balding head. "We prepare for both possibilities. Those who choose to leave should go in organized groups, with sufficient supplies and clear destinations." Caleb's gaze swept the room, making eye contact with key community members. "Those who stay need to create defensible spaces around structures, clear brush, wet down roofs when possible, and prepare emergency shelter in the mine tunnels if the worst happens." The practical approach, acknowledging the danger while offering concrete actions rather than simple reassurance, seemed to steady the room. Discussion turned to logistics. Which families might leave together, what supplies could be spared, how the remaining water supply should be rationed. Later, as they walked home through the smoke-shrouded town, Maggie looked up at her husband's profile. "You should have been a military commander, not just a military doctor," she observed. "You have a way of calming people in crisis." Caleb's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Panic kills more reliably than most diseases. Giving people something useful to do is the best medicine sometimes." "And what about us?" Maggie asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them since the fire began. "Should we leave, for hope's sake, if nothing else?" Caleb was silent for several paces, considering. Hope had developed a worrying cough from the smoke, despite their efforts to keep the house as clean-aired as possible. Many of the town's children suffered similarly, their small lungs more vulnerable to the contaminated air. "The high meadow," he said finally. "The one where I found you last winter. It's sheltered from the west by rock faces. Air should be clearer there. And there's a spring that won't dry up even in this heat." "You want us to go back to your cabin?" The suggestion surprised Maggie. They hadn't visited the place since moving to town, though Caleb occasionally spoke of returning to check on trap lines or gather specific medicinal plants that grew in that area. "Just you and Hope," he clarified. "I need to stay here. Too many. People need medical attention, but you could take the worst affected children, maybe 2 or 3 mothers, to help care for them, just until the air clears or the rains come." The idea of separating, even temporarily, sent a spike of anxiety through Maggie. They had not been apart since the day he had found her in the snow. Yet she understood the logic of his suggestion, could see the worry in his eyes when he looked at Hope's flushed face and listened to her labored breathing. "How long?" she asked, already calculating what would need to be packed, which families might be most in need of this escape. "A week, 2 at most. The seasonal rains have to come soon." He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't think it was necessary." "I know." She squeezed his hand in return. "I trust your judgment, Caleb. We'll go tomorrow." The decision made, they spent the evening in preparation. Caleb spoke with the families of the most affected children, while Maggie packed provisions and medicines. 5 children would make the journey, along with Maggie, Hope, and 2 other mothers. Mrs. Erickson, whose twins had been particularly hard hit by the smoke, and young Mrs. Davis, whose husband was away with a prospecting party and whose infant son had developed an alarming wheeze. By dawn, their small caravan was ready, 1 wagon loaded with supplies and the smallest children, the others walking alongside. Caleb had arranged for Mr. Colton's son to drive them as far as the trail would allow, after which they would need to proceed on foot to the cabin. "It's no more than 2 miles from where the wagon must stop," Caleb explained as he helped secure the last of their provisions. "The path is clear. I checked it just last month when gathering those valerian roots you wanted." Maggie nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. She had made the journey in reverse only, once too focused on survival, and then on Hope's impending birth to note landmarks or features that might guide her now. The moment of departure was harder than she had anticipated. Standing beside the wagon in the eerie yellow light of dawn, Hope fretful in her arms, Maggie suddenly felt the weight of responsibility pressing down upon her, not just for her own child, but for all these small lives entrusted to her care. "You can do this," Caleb said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. He pressed a folded paper into her hand. A map showing the trail and the cabin. "Though I think your feet will remember the way, even if your mind doesn't." There was so much she wanted to say in that moment, so many emotions tangling in her chest. Instead, she leaned up and kissed him, a brief but fierce pressing of lips that conveyed what words could not: love, trust, determination to return. "1 week," she said as she pulled back, "2 at most. I'll come for you if the fire changes direction," he promised. "Otherwise, wait for the rain." With that, they parted, Caleb returning to the demands of a town under siege from smoke and fear, Maggie leading her small band of refugees toward the higher, clearer air of the mountains that had once been her salvation. The journey proved more difficult than anticipated. Though the road leading out of town was clear enough, the smoke grew thicker as they climbed, limiting visibility and forcing frequent stops for the children to rest and drink water. By the time they reached the point where the wagon could go no further, it was mid-afternoon, and even the adults were struggling with the contaminated air. "We need to move quickly now," Maggie told Mrs. Erickson and Mrs. Davis as they gathered their children and the most essential supplies. "The cabin isn't far, and the air should improve as we get above this smoke layer." She tried to project confidence, though the forest around them was unnervingly still. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the distant roar of the fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Hope, strapped to her chest in a carrier Caleb had fashioned, whimpered softly, her face pressed against Maggie's shoulder as if seeking protection from the very air around them. The trail Caleb had marked on his map was indeed visible, though less defined than Maggie had hoped. They moved as swiftly as circumstances allowed, the two mothers carrying their youngest children, while the older ones, the Erickson twins, aged 4, and the Davis boy, who was nearly 6, trudged alongside, unusually subdued by the oppressive atmosphere. True to Caleb's prediction, the air began to clear as they climbed higher, the dense smoke settling in the valleys while the upper slopes remained relatively untouched. By the time they caught their first glimpse of the cabin, so familiar to Maggie, yet strange now in the context of her new life, they were all breathing more easily, the children's spirits visibly lifting as they escaped the suffocating blanket below. "It's not much," Maggie said apologetically as they approached the simple structure that had been her sanctuary through the winter. "But the air is clean, and there's fresh water from the spring." "It's perfect," Mrs. Erickson declared, her relief evident as one of her twins actually laughed, a sound none of them had heard in days. "I'd sleep on bare rock if it meant my babies could breathe freely again." The cabin was much as Caleb had left it. Tidy, functional, with basic provisions, still stored on shelves and firewood stacked neatly beside the hearth. Maggie felt a strange doubling of memory as she stepped inside, as if the woman who had lain on that cot, desperate and alone, was someone else entirely, a ghost from a past life who shared her face, but not her heart. "We should open all the windows," she instructed, setting down her pack. "Get as much fresh air circulating as possible. Mrs. Davis, could you check the spring? The path is just behind the cabin through those juniper bushes. Mrs. Erickson, if you could help me arrange sleeping areas for everyone. Taking charge came more naturally to Maggie now than it would have 6 months earlier. The confidence she had gained through working alongside Caleb, through being trusted with Patient's care and Hope's well-being, manifested in a quiet authority that the other women responded to without question. By nightfall, they had established a comfortable routine. The cabin was too small for all of them to sleep inside comfortably, so they had created a sheltered sleeping area on the porch using canvas brought from town. The children, exhausted from the journey and the days of breathing smoke, fell asleep. Quickly, their breathing already noticeably easier in the mountain air. Maggie sat outside long after the others had retired, Hope asleep in her arms, watching the eerie glow of the fire on the distant ridges. From this vantage point, she could see its scope more clearly. A line of flame that stretched for miles along the western mountains, occasionally leaping higher when it found particularly rich fuel. Beautiful in its terrible way, like so many dangerous things. She thought of Caleb, down in that smoke-filled valley, tending to those who couldn't escape. Worry gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. He was capable, careful, and knew these mountains better than anyone. He would be fine. They all would be fine. The rain would come, the fire would die, and life would return to its new normal. As if in answer to this thought, Hope stirred in her arms, making the small snuffling sounds that usually preceded waking and demands for feeding. Maggie adjusted her position, preparing to nurse, and as she did, she caught a flash of movement at the edge of the clearing surrounding the cabin. Her body tensed instinctively, arms tightening around Hope. The mountains held their share of predators. Mountain lions, bears emerged from hibernation, hungry and aggressive. The occasional wolf pack. Caleb had taught her to be aware, to make noise when walking forest trails, to never leave food exposed around the cabin. But this was no animal. As her eyes adjusted, focusing on the spot where she had detected movement, Maggie made out the unmistakable silhouette of a man standing just within the tree line, tall, broad-shouldered, watching the cabin with an intensity she could feel across the distance. For one heart-stopping moment, she thought it might be Caleb, having followed them up the mountain out of concern or because the fire had worsened. But this figure was wrong somehow. The stance different, the proportions not quite matching her husband's familiar outline. Hope chose that moment to cry out, a sharp, hungry sound that carried in the still night air. The figure in the trees shifted, taking a half step forward before stopping, as if uncertain. Terror and protective instinct surged through Maggie in equal measure. She stood, backing toward the cabin door, keeping her eyes fixed on the shadow. Among the trees. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Show yourself." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the figure emerged from the tree line into the moonlight that flooded the clearing. Maggie's breath caught in her throat, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were telling her. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. But as the man took another step forward, his features became unmistakable even in the silver half-light. The same strong jaw she had traced with her fingers 100 times. The same broad shoulders that had carried their trunks from the wagon that would take them west. The same eyes, now wide with disbelief as they took in the woman standing before him with a baby in her arms. "Maggie." His voice was rough, as if unused for a long time, but achingly familiar. "My God. Maggie, is that you?" Hope squirmed against her chest, sensing her mother's distress. Maggie's knees threatened to buckle, and she gripped the doorframe for support, her world tilting dangerously as reality itself seemed to warp around her. "Samuel," she whispered, the name feeling foreign on her tongue after so many months of disuse. "Samuel Bell?" He stepped closer, close enough now that she could see the scar along his hairline that hadn't been there before. The gauntness in his cheeks that spoke of hardship. The mixture of joy and confusion in his eyes as they moved from her face to the child in her arms. "They told me you were dead," he said simply. "Montgomery, the others, said you died in the mountains." Maggie's mind raced, trying to make sense of this apparition from her past. Samuel had died. She had watched him cough blood until there was nothing left, had helped bury him beside the trail with the other victims of the sickness that had plagued their wagon train. Hadn't she? But even as these thoughts tumbled through her mind, another memory surfaced of fever-induced delirium in those final days, of being kept from his wagon as the sickness worsened, of Montgomery's hand on her shoulder as he told her it was over, that her husband was gone. "I buried you," she said, her voice barely audible over Hope's increasingly insistent cries. "We all did. 3 weeks into the journey." Samuel shook his head slowly. "I was sick, very sick. They left me at a trading post, thought I wouldn't last the night, but there was a doctor there, a real miracle worker. Brought me back somehow." His gaze dropped to Hope again, confusion deepening. "Maggie, whose child is that?" The question hung between them, simple yet impossibly complex. How could she explain that this was his daughter, born to a woman who believed herself a widow? A child who had never known her father's name because he was supposed to be months dead and buried. A baby now called Hope Thornton, daughter of a mountain doctor who had saved her mother from death in the snow. Before Maggie could find words to begin this impossible explanation, the cabin door opened behind her, and Mrs. Erickson appeared, drawn by Hope's cries and the sound of voices. "Maggie, is everything all right? Who are you talking to out here?" Samuel's eyes moved to the stranger, then back to Maggie, questions multiplying in his gaze. "What is this place? Why are you here in the middle of nowhere with a baby and—" He gestured toward Mrs. Erickson, clearly struggling to make sense of the scene. Hope's cries escalated to full-blown wails, the tension in the air affecting her, even without understanding its cause. Maggie bounced her automatically, maternal, instincts operating independently of the shock paralyzing the rest of her mind. "You'd better come inside," she said finally, stepping back to make room in the doorway. There's a lot to explain." As Samuel moved toward her, this ghost made flesh, this past resurrected, Maggie felt as if she were standing at the edge of a precipice, the solid ground of her new life crumbling beneath her feet. Behind her lay the warmth of the cabin, the children sleeping peacefully, the simple existence she had built from the ashes of tragedy. Before her stood the man whose memory she had honored, whose child she had carried, whose death she had mourned, and eventually moved beyond. And somewhere below, in a smoke-filled valley, was Caleb, her husband, Hope's father, in all the ways that truly mattered, the man who had found her when all others had abandoned her. Caleb, who had no idea that the foundation of their life together had just been shaken to its core. As Samuel ducked to enter the low doorway, following her into the lamplight that would reveal all the changes time and hardship had wrought on both of them, Maggie sent a silent prayer into the night, for strength, for clarity, and most of all, for the wisdom to navigate this impossible crossroads without destroying everything and everyone she loved. The cabin's interior seemed to shrink with Samuel's presence. He stood awkwardly near the door, too large somehow for this space that had once been his refuge. Mrs. Erickson had retreated to the far corner where the children slept, her eyes wide with confusion and something like fear as she watched the exchange between Maggie and this stranger, who clearly was no stranger at all. "Your baby needs feeding," Samuel said, his eyes fixed on Hope's red, angry face. His voice held no accusation yet, just bewilderment, as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Maggie nodded, grateful for the simple, immediate task that would give her a moment to gather her thoughts. She moved to the rocking chair near the hearth, Caleb's chair, where he had sat through countless evenings carving toys for Hope or reading from his small collection of books. The familiar creak of its runners against the wooden floor brought a sharp pang of longing for his steady presence. As she settled Hope at her breast, the baby's cries immediately ceased, replaced by the rhythmic sounds of nursing. Samuel looked away, a flush rising in his gaunt cheeks. Whatever he had endured since they parted had not entirely stripped away the modesty that had always been part of his nature. "You should sit," Maggie said, nodding toward the small table where 3 rough-hewn chairs stood. "This might take some time." Samuel sat, his large frame making the chair look like a child's furniture. His hands, once strong and capable, now thin with prominent veins, rested on the tabletop, fingers tapping an uncertain rhythm. "I don't understand," he began, his voice low to avoid waking the children. "Montgomery told me you died. When I finally recovered enough to travel, I followed the trail as best I could, found what I thought was your grave." The revelation struck Maggie like a physical blow. "My grave?" Samuel nodded, pain etching deeper lines around his eyes. "A small marker, just a wooden cross with your name, near the Eastern Pass. I thought I'd lost you both." Both. The word hung in the air between them. He had known about the baby then, had grieved not just for his wife, but for his unborn child. "Montgomery left me to die," Maggie said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within. "In a blizzard, said I was slowing them down, endangering the others, that one life, or 2, wasn't worth risking the whole train." Samuel's face darkened, his hands curling into fists on the tabletop. "That son of a—" He cut himself off, glancing toward the sleeping children. "I'll kill him." "He thinks I'm already dead," Maggie pointed out. "Probably thinks you are too." "How did you survive?" His eyes moved to Hope, who was still nursing contentedly, oblivious to the tension surrounding her. "How did she—" Maggie took a deep breath, knowing there was no gentle way to explain what came next. "A man found me. A doctor who lived alone. In these mountains. He brought me here to this cabin, his cabin, took care of me through the winter, helped deliver Hope when her time came." Understanding began to dawn in Samuel's eyes. "This doctor, he's a good man?" The simplicity of the question belied its weight. Maggie thought of Caleb, his quiet strength, his unwavering support, his gentle hands that had guided Hope into the world and then taught her own how to heal others. "Yes," she said softly, "one of the best I've ever known." Samuel nodded slowly, absorbing this. And now, where is he? Here was the crux of it, the truth that could not be softened or delayed. "In Silverpine, the settlement in the valley below. There's a forest fire. The smoke was making the children sick. He sent us up here for cleaner air, while he stays to tend those who couldn't leave. Us." Samuel's gaze moved to Mrs. Erickson and the sleeping children. Some of the town's children were suffering badly from the smoke. Their mothers came with me for help. Maggie paused, then added the final piece. "We have a practice there, Caleb and I. He handles the medical cases, and I work with herbs, remedies. We're partners." The word was deliberately chosen, ambiguous enough to delay the full revelation, yet honest in its own way. They were partners in healing, in raising hope, in building a life neither had expected to find. But Samuel was too perceptive, too attuned to her despite their months apart, to miss what remained unsaid. "Partners," he repeated, the word hollow. His eyes dropped to her left hand, where a simple gold band, not the one he had placed there, circled her finger. "You married him?" It wasn't a question. Maggie nodded anyway, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Hope finished nursing, squirmed against her, and Maggie automatically lifted her to her shoulder, patting the small back until a soft burp rewarded her efforts. Samuel watched this domestic ritual with an expression that shifted between wonder and grief. "She's beautiful," he said finally. "Truly beautiful. What's her name?" Hope. Maggie smiled despite herself, as she always did when speaking her daughter's name. Hope Samuel Bell. The middle name had been Caleb's suggestion, a way to honor the father her child would never know. Except now. Bell, Samuel repeated. Not Thornton, Maggie supplied. Caleb Thornton. Samuel absorbed this information with a slight nod, his eyes never leaving Hope's face. The baby, now alert after feeding, regarded this stranger with solemn curiosity, her tiny brow furrowed in an expression so like his own that it made Maggie's chest ache. "May I?" he asked, extending his hands tentatively. After a moment's hesitation that she immediately felt guilty for, Maggie placed Hope in her father's arms. Samuel cradled her with the careful reverence of someone handling something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. Hope studied his face with the intense focus she brought to all new discoveries, one small hand reaching up to touch his beard. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your..." He looked up at Maggie, sudden uncertainty in his eyes. What am I to her now? The question cut to the heart of their impossible situation. By law and by blood, Samuel was Hope's father, but in all the ways that mattered, day too. Day, the midnight wakings, the first smile, the countless small moments that formed the tapestry of her young life, that role belonged to Caleb. "I don't know," Maggie admitted. "I never thought, never imagined this could happen." Samuel looked back at Hope, who had grasped one of his fingers in her tiny hand. "Neither did I. When I saw that grave," his voice broke. "I've been wandering these mountains for months, Maggie, taking odd jobs at mining camps, trapping when I could, just existing, not really living. And now, everything's changed again," she finished for him. He nodded, gently bouncing Hope as she began to fuss. "She has my eyes." "Yes. And your chin. That little dimple right there." His finger traced the feature lightly, earning a gurgle of approval from Hope. Maggie watched them together. This man who had been her first love, this child who was his, flesh and blood, and felt herself torn between past and present, between what had been and what now was. Part of her heart rejoiced to see Samuel alive, to witness this meeting that should rightfully have happened months ago in far different circumstances. Another part trembled with fear for what this resurrection meant for the life she had built. With Caleb, the vows they had made, the future they had planned. "What happens now?" Samuel asked, voicing the question that hung heavy in the air between them. Before Maggie could attempt an answer, a sound from outside caught their attention. Footsteps on the porch, then a knock at the door. Mrs. Erickson, who had been a silent witness to their conversation, moved to answer it. A young boy stood there, perhaps 12 or 13, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "Message from town," he panted, "for Mrs. Thornton." Maggie rose quickly, setting aside the tangle of emotions to focus on this new development. "What? Is it, Tommy? Is something wrong?" The boy glanced curiously at Samuel, but didn't comment on the stranger's presence. "Fires jumped the ridge to the north, ma'am. Doc Thornton says you should stay put for now, but be ready to move higher if needed. He's sending more supplies up tomorrow and will try to come himself if he can get away." Caleb, always thinking ahead, always ensuring their safety even from a distance. Maggie felt a wave of gratitude for his foresight, quickly followed by a renewed sense of dread at the confrontation that now seemed inevitable. "Thank you, Tommy. Will you be staying the night or heading back down?" "Heading back, ma'am. Doc needs all hands in town, and I'm big enough to help now." The boy's chest puffed slightly with pride. Just wanted to deliver the message directly like he asked. Maggie rummaged in her pack and produced a small bundle of dried fruit and nuts. "Take this for the journey and be careful on those trails in the dark." Tommy accepted the food with a grin and a quick nod to Samuel before disappearing into the night. Maggie closed the door behind him, turning back to face the impossible situation waiting inside. Samuel had risen, still holding Hope, who was beginning to drowse against his shoulder. "Your husband," he said, the word clearly difficult for him to speak. "He sounds like a good man." "He is," Maggie confirmed, unable to deny this fundamental truth even in these strangest of circumstances. "And he loves you? Treats you well?" "Yes." Samuel nodded, his expression complex. Relief mingled with pain, resignation with determination. "Good. That's good." He gently transferred the now sleeping Hope back to Maggie's arms. "I should go. Let you rest. We can talk more tomorrow." "Go where?" Maggie asked, suddenly alarmed at the thought of him disappearing into the night, back into the realm of ghosts and might-have-beens. "I've been camping about a mile east of here, following game trails, looking for work at the mining camps." He gestured vaguely toward the door. "I'll be back at first light. We have much to discuss." The understatement would have been comical in any other circumstance. Maggie wanted to protest, to make him stay, to hash out some resolution tonight, rather than endure hours of uncertainty. But exhaustion was settling over her like a heavy blanket, the shock of Samuel's appearance draining what little energy remained after the difficult journey up the mountain. "First light," she agreed. "We'll figure this out, Samuel, somehow." He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that carried echoes of the young man who had once promised to build her a fine house in California. "We always did, didn't we? Figure things out together." Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Maggie stood motionless in the center of the cabin, Hope warm and heavy in her arms, feeling as if she were balanced on a knife's edge between two lives. The one she had thought lost forever, and the one she had built from its ashes. Who was that man? Mrs. Erickson's whispered question broke through her reverie. The older woman had returned to her sleeping children, but was watching Maggie with undisguised concern. "My husband," Maggie replied, the words falling from her lips before she could consider them. Then, realizing the confusion this must cause, she clarified. "My first husband, Hope's father. We thought he died on the trail west last winter." Mrs. Erickson's eyes widened, her hand moving to her heart in a gesture of sympathy or shock, perhaps both. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," she breathed. "What will you do?" It was the question Maggie had been asking herself from the moment she recognized Samuel, standing at the edge of the clearing. What would she do? What could anyone do in such an impossible situation? "I don't know," she admitted, moving to place Hope in her makeshift cradle. "I truly don't know." Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and haunted by dreams. Samuel and Caleb standing on opposite sides of a chasm, both reaching for her. Hope crying in a darkness where Maggie couldn't find her. Snow falling, burning as it touched her skin. She woke before dawn, disoriented momentarily by the familiar yet strange surroundings of the cabin where her new life had begun. The events of the previous night rushed back, and she sat up quickly, checking first on Hope, still sleeping peacefully, then on the other children. All was quiet. The cabin bathed in the grey half-light that preceded sunrise in the mountains. Maggie dressed quickly and slipped outside, needing air and space to think before Samuel returned as promised. The morning was cool, a welcome respite from the heat that had plagued the valley. From the porch, she could see that the fire had indeed jumped to the northern ridge overnight, a new line of flames visible against the lightening sky. Smoke hung in the valleys below like lakes of fog, confirming the wisdom of Caleb's decision to send them to higher ground. Caleb. Her heart contracted at the thought of him down there, working tirelessly to help others while unaware that his world was about to change as dramatically as hers had. Whatever happened next would hurt him. The man who had saved her, who had loved her and hope without reservation, who had offered a future when she thought hers was over. A sound from the trail drew her attention. Samuel emerged from the trees, moving with the deliberate grace that had always characterized him despite his size. He carried a bundle over one shoulder, his few possessions, she guessed, and something smaller in his hands. "You're up early," he said as he approached, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "You never were one for sleeping past dawn." The casual observation, this small, intimate knowledge of her habits, struck Maggie with unexpected force. This was the man who had known her since childhood, who had courted her with wildflowers and clumsy poetry, who had shared her bed and her dreams and her grief when month after month passed without the child they both longed for, until hope. The child conceived just weeks before illness took him from her, or so she had believed. "I wanted some time to think," she replied, watching as he climbed the steps to join her on the porch. "Before everyone else wakes." Samuel nodded, understanding without need for explanation. He held out the object in his hands, a small carved wooden horse, rough but recognizable, its mane flowing as if caught in mid-gallop. "For hope," he said. "Made it last night, couldn't sleep, so—" He shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "It's not very good, just something to play with." Maggie accepted the carving, turning it over in her hands. The gesture was so like Caleb's, regular gifts of carved animals, that she felt a fresh wave of confusion wash over her. These two men, so different in many ways, shared this same impulse to create, to provide, to connect through the work of their hands. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "She'll love it." Samuel's expression brightened slightly at this, then grew serious again. "Maggie, I've been thinking all night about us, about what happens now. So have I." She leaned against the porch, railing, facing him directly. "There aren't any easy answers, Samuel." "No," he agreed, "but there are right ones. Hard, maybe, but right." He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as if preparing to lift a heavy burden. "I'm your husband. Maggie, Hope's father, by law and before God." The statement hung between them, undeniable in its factual accuracy, yet painfully inadequate to address the complexity of their situation. "Yes," she acknowledged, "but I'm also Caleb's wife now." We spoke vows before God too, vows I meant with all my heart. When you thought I was dead, there was no accusation in Samuel's tone, just a statement of fact. "You wouldn't have married him otherwise. I know you, Maggie, know your heart." Did he? Did anyone truly know the heart that beat in her chest now? Scarred by grief, transformed by motherhood, expanded by a love she had never expected to find again? "That doesn't make my vows to him any less real," she said quietly. "Or my commitment to the life we've built." Samuel paced the length of the porch, his movements restless like a caged animal. "I understand that. I do. But what choice do we have? The law is clear. A second marriage, entered into while the first spouse still lives, isn't valid." "The law?" Maggie repeated, a hint of bitterness coloring her tone. "The law didn't save me when Montgomery left me to die. The law didn't deliver my baby or heal the sick children in Silverpine. Men like Caleb do that. Men who care more for what's right than what's written on some paper in a courthouse miles from here." And the passion in her defense surprised even her. Samuel stopped his pacing, studying her with newfound awareness. "You love him," he said simply. "Not just gratitude, not just partnership. You love him the way you once loved me." The direct confrontation with this truth left Maggie momentarily speechless. Did she love Caleb? Yes, without question. Differently than she had loved Samuel, less like the fiery passion of youth, and more like the steady flame that sustains through the darkest nights, but no less deeply for that difference. Yes, she admitted finally, I do love him. Samuel absorbed this, pain flickering across his features before settling into something more resolved. And me? Do you still love me at all, Maggie? Or am I just a ghost to you now? A memory you've put aside? The question cut to her core. Of course I still love you, she whispered. How could I not? You were my first love, my closest friend, Hope's father. When I thought you died, part of me died too. But you found a way to live again. There was no resentment in his voice, only a sad understanding. To love again. Yes. Samuel moved closer, his eyes searching hers. Then what do we do? I won't force you, Maggie. Won't drag you back to a life you've moved beyond. But I can't just walk away either, not from you, not from my daughter. The sincerity in his voice, the depth of his struggle, touched Maggie deeply. This was the Samuel she had always known, principled, thoughtful, willing to sacrifice his own happiness for those he loved. She had married him as much for these qualities as for the passion they had shared. Before she could respond, the cabin door opened, and Mrs. Erickson emerged with Hope in her arms, the baby fussing with early morning hunger. She's looking for you, the older woman said, glancing curiously between Maggie and Samuel as she handed over the child. The other children are still sleeping, but this one has her mother's early habits, it seems. Hope settled immediately as Maggie took her, small hands patting her mother's face in familiar greeting. Samuel watched this exchange with naked longing, the depth of his loss evident in every line of his body. Could I hold her again? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Just for a moment, before... Maggie nodded, carefully transferring Hope to his arms. The baby regarded him solemnly, then reached up to grasp his beard as she had the night before, earning a soft laugh from Samuel. She's fearless, he observed, like her mother. The moment of connection was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats on the trail below, someone approaching at speed. Maggie's heart lurched, knowing instinctively who it must be. Only one person would ride up this mountain with such urgency, especially with a forest fire threatening the valley below. Caleb. As if confirming her thought, his voice called from the bend in the trail, still out of sight but unmistakable. Maggie, are you all right up there? Samuel stiffened, his arms tightening slightly around Hope before deliberately relaxing again. He looked at Maggie, a question in his eyes. I should take her, she said softly, reaching for the baby. It shouldn't happen like this. Samuel relinquished Hope reluctantly, his hands lingering briefly as if memorizing the feel of her. Then he straightened, turning to face the trail where Caleb would appear at any moment. Your husband seems like a man who deserves the truth directly, he said. No matter how difficult. Maggie couldn't argue with this assessment of Caleb's character. If their positions were reversed, he would want honesty, however painful. She moved to the edge of the porch, Hope secure in her arms, and called back. We're fine, Caleb. Everyone's safe. A moment later, he appeared on horseback, riding one of the sturdy mountain ponies used by the miners to navigate the steep trails. Even from a distance, Maggie could see the exhaustion etched in his features, the soot that darkened his clothing, evidence of sleepless nights fighting the effects of the fire below. He dismounted quickly, securing the horse to a nearby pine before striding toward the cabin. His focus was so intent on Maggie and Hope that he didn't immediately register Samuel's presence on the porch. The fire jumped the northern firebreak, he called as he approached. Town's still safe, but I wanted to check on you. Make sure you had enough supplies if you need to stay longer or move higher. Only as he reached the bottom of the porch steps did he notice the stranger standing beside his wife and child. He paused, wariness replacing relief in his expression. Caleb, Maggie began, her voice unsteady despite her best efforts. This is Samuel Bell, Samuel finished for her, stepping forward with his hand extended. Maggie's husband, Hope's father. The color drained from Caleb's face, his eyes moving from Samuel to Maggie in disbelief. For a man typically so composed, so measured in his reactions, the naked shock in his expression was all the more profound. "That's not possible," he said finally, his voice low. "You died. On the trail. Months ago." Samuel shook his head. "Nearly. Died. Was left for dead at a trading post while the wagon train continued on, recovered slowly. Been searching for Maggie ever since." Caleb absorbed this, his mind visibly working through the implications with the same methodical precision he brought to diagnosing a difficult case. His eyes found Maggie's, silently asking for confirmation. "It's true," she said softly. "It's really him, Caleb." Something shifted in Caleb's expression then, a subtle hardening, a withdrawal behind walls she hadn't seen since those earliest days in his cabin. He straightened, his hand dropping to his side without accepting Samuel's. Offered handshake. "I see," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "And how long have you been here, Mr. Bell?" "Just since last night," Samuel replied, withdrawing his hand without offense. "I've been following game trails in these mountains for weeks, saw smoke from the cabin chimney, came to investigate, found," he gestured toward Maggie and Hope, "found what I thought I'd lost forever." Caleb nodded once, processing this. "And now?" The simple question contained multitudes. Now what will you do? Now what happens to us? Now where do we go from here? "Now we need to talk," Samuel said. "All of us, about what's right, what's best for Maggie and Hope." "Best for Maggie and Hope," Caleb repeated, a hint of bitter irony in his tone. His eyes met Maggie's again, and she saw in them a depth of pain that belied his composed exterior. "And what do you think that is, Mr. Bell?" Samuel hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. "I think that's something we need to decide together. There's no easy answer here." "No," Caleb agreed, his gaze still fixed on Maggie. "There isn't." Hope chose that moment to squirm in Maggie's arms, reaching toward Caleb with the clear expectation of being transferred to him. A daily ritual whenever he returned home, now, made painfully poignant by the circumstances. Caleb's expression softened as he looked at the baby, something like resignation passing over his features. Without a word, he stepped onto the porch and took Hope from Maggie's arms, settling her against his shoulder with the practiced ease of months of caregiving. "Hello, little one," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her dark hair. "I've missed you." The simple tenderness of the gesture brought tears to Maggie's eyes. Here was the man who had delivered her child, who had taught her to change diapers and mix formula from goat's milk when her own supply faltered, who had walked the cabin floor for countless hours when Hope was colicky or teething. Samuel watched this interaction with a complex expression, respect mingled with pain, understanding with loss. In that moment, the full weight of their impossible situation settled over all three adults on that porch. Two men who could legitimately claim the title of Hope's father. One woman torn between past and present, all of them caught in a web of circumstances none had chosen or deserved. "Perhaps," Caleb said finally, his voice steady despite the emotion Maggie could see him suppressing, "we should continue this conversation inside, away from the smoke and the sun. It promises to be a long day." The understatement hung in the air between them, a bridge of shared understanding, despite the chasm that had just opened beneath their feet. Whatever resolution they might reach, the path to it would be neither short nor easy. As they moved toward the cabin door, Maggie caught Caleb's free hand in hers, needing some physical connection to the man whose life had just been upended as dramatically as her own. After a moment's hesitation, his fingers tightened around hers. Not forgiveness or acceptance necessarily, but acknowledgement that whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything since that snowy night when he found her, half dead on the mountainside, together, one step at a time, with no promises beyond doing their best with the cards fate had dealt them. Samuel held the door open, watching this small exchange with eyes that had seen too much suffering to begrudge any moment of comfort. As the three adults and the child between them crossed the threshold into the cabin's dim interior, the fire on the northern ridge flared higher, consuming dead wood and undergrowth, transforming destruction into the possibility of new growth, a mirror to the painful but perhaps necessary burning away of certainty that was about to begin inside those log walls. Inside the cabin, Mrs. Erickson and Mrs. Davis had awakened the children and were preparing a simple breakfast, the domestic routine continuing despite the tension that filled the air. Seeing the three adults enter, Mrs. Erickson quickly assessed the situation and took charge. "Children, let's eat outside this morning. It's a fine day and the air is clearer." She began ushering the sleepy youngsters onto the porch, Mrs. Davis following with bowls of porridge. As she passed Maggie, she whispered, "Take all the time you need," a small kindness that Maggie acknowledged with a grateful nod. When the door closed behind them, the cabin seemed unnaturally quiet. Hope, still in Caleb's arms, surveyed the room with bright, curious eyes, unaware of the gravity settling around her. Caleb stood near the hearth, his posture rigid, while Samuel took position by the window, creating a triangle with Maggie at its center. "I should check on the children," Maggie said, reaching for Hope. It was a retreat and they all knew it, but neither man objected as she took the baby and stepped outside, leaving them alone together. In her absence, the two men regarded each other with cautious assessment. Despite the circumstances, there was no hostility between them, only the somber recognition of an impossible situation neither had created, but both must now navigate. "You saved her life," Samuel said finally. "Both their lives." Caleb nodded once, his expression guarded. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Samuel countered. "Not anyone. Not Montgomery, who left her to die. Not the townspeople who turned her away when she needed help most. You." He paused, visibly struggling with what came next. "And you've cared for them, protected them, loved them." "Yes." The simple affirmation carried the weight of months of shared existence, the quiet nights and busy days, the gradual building of trust and intimacy, the foundation of a life he had thought secure until this moment. Samuel moved to the table, his fingers tracing the rough wood grain. "I have no right to judge what grew between you. You both believed I was dead, made choices accordingly." He looked up, meeting Caleb's steady gaze. "Honorable choices from what I can see, but legally invalid," Caleb supplied, voicing the unavoidable truth. "With your return, the law's one thing, life's another." Samuel sighed heavily. "I spent months tracking that wagon train, following rumors, searching for any sign of Maggie. Found what I thought was her grave instead. Marker with her name. Fresh turned earth, felt like my heart was buried there too." Caleb could picture it all too clearly. This man kneeling before a false grave, mourning what he believed lost forever, just as Maggie had mourned him. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. "She grieved you deeply," he said quietly. "Spoke of you often. Wanted Hope to know about her father, the good man he was." Something in Samuel's expression cracked at this, the careful composure giving way to raw emotion. "And now?" he asked, his voice rough. "What am I to them now? A ghost made flesh? An intruder in the life they've built with you?" The question hung between them, impossible to answer yet demanding response. Caleb moved to the window, looking out at Maggie sitting on the porch steps with Hope in her lap. surrounded by the other children. The scene he had imagined countless times during their separation, his family safe, waiting for his return, now viewed through the prism of newfound uncertainty. "What do you want, Mr. Bell?" he asked finally, turning back to face Samuel. "From Maggie, from Hope, from this situation none of us chose." Samuel considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "I want my wife and daughter," he answered honestly. "The future we planned together." Then more softly, "But I also want their happiness, and I'm beginning to see those things might not be the same anymore." Outside, Hope's delighted laugh carried through the open window, a reminder of the innocent life caught in this tangle of adult complications. Both men turned toward the sound instinctively, their shared love for the child momentarily bridging the chasm between them. "She knows you as her father," Samuel acknowledged, the admission clearly painful. "Reaches for you without hesitation." "I've been there since her first breath," Caleb replied, neither boastful nor apologetic, simply stating a fact that couldn't be changed. "Watched her grow from the moment she entered this world." "A gift I can never know," Samuel said, the words heavy with loss. "No matter what happens next." The fire on the northern ridge flared suddenly, a tall column of flame visible through the window as it found fresh fuel. Both men observed it silently, recognizing the apt metaphor for the conflagration threatening to consume the lives they had each built. When Maggie returned, Hope sleeping against her shoulder after the excitement of breakfast, she found the men sitting at the table across from each other. Not comfortable, certainly, but no longer positioned like opposing forces. They looked up as she entered, and she was struck by the similar expressions on their faces: concern for her, determination to find a path forward, willingness to sacrifice for those they loved. "Hope's asleep," she said unnecessarily, her voice hushed. "The journey and all this excitement wore her out." Caleb nodded toward the makeshift cradle in the corner. "She should rest while she can. We all should, with the fire spreading." As Maggie settled Hope in the cradle, tucking the blanket around her small form, she steeled herself for the conversation that could no longer be delayed. Joining the men. At the table, she placed her hands flat on the surface, anchoring herself to its solidity. "I need to speak," she said quietly but firmly. "Both of you have claims, legal, moral, emotional. Both of you deserve consideration. But this is my life too, my daughter's life, and I need to be heard." The men exchanged glances, then nodded in unison. Maggie took a deep breath, organizing thoughts that had churned within her since Samuel's appearance the previous night. "Samuel, when I thought you died, a part of me died too. The future we planned, the dreams we shared, all buried in that grave by the trail." Her voice softened. "I loved you deeply, always will in some way. You're Hope's father by blood, the man who gave her life." Samuel's eyes glistened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. "Caleb," she turned to him, "you found me at my lowest moment, saved me when no one else would, became not just my rescuer, but my partner, my husband, Hope's father in all the ways that matter day to day. Our marriage may not be legally binding anymore, but the promises we made to each other are no less real for that." Caleb's expression remained carefully controlled, but she saw the slight tremor in his hand resting on the table, evidence of the emotion he contained with such effort. "I won't be passed from one man to another like property," Maggie continued, her voice gathering strength. "Won't have my future decided without my voice being heard. The law may say one thing, but we're beyond the reach of courthouses and judges here. We need to find our own justice, our own path forward." "What are you suggesting?" Samuel asked gently. Maggie looked between them, these two good men caught in an impossible situation. "I'm suggesting we take time, not rush into decisions that will shape all our lives forever. The fire below forces us to stay here a while longer. Let's use that time to consider all possibilities, to find a solution that honors what we all have lost and might yet preserve. The wisdom of this approach was undeniable, though it prolonged the uncertainty each felt. Still, as adults responsible not just for their own happiness, but for Hope's future, patience was perhaps the only true virtue available to them. "And Hope?" Caleb asked, voicing the question most central to all their concerns. What do we tell her? What does she call each of us as she grows? It was the question that had haunted Maggie through her sleepless night, how to explain to her daughter, when she was old enough to understand, the extraordinary circumstances of her early life and the two fathers who loved her. "The truth," she said finally, "when she's old enough, that she was born of one good man's love and raised by another's, that she is the daughter of both in different ways, equally treasured by each." Outside, the children's voices rose in some game or discovery, life continuing its forward momentum despite the adults' dilemmas. Inside the cradle, Hope slept peacefully, her small chest rising and falling with each breath, untroubled by the complexities surrounding her existence. "I need to return to town soon," Caleb said after a thoughtful silence. "The fire's spreading. More people will need medical attention. I can't abandon them, even with—" He gestured at the situation before them, unable to fully articulate its enormity. "Of course," Maggie agreed. "Your patients need you." Samuel watched this exchange with an expression that shifted from pain to something like resignation, then resolute determination. "I could help," he offered unexpectedly, "with the fire, with the injured. I've worked as a carpenter, have some experience with burns and injuries." The offer surprised both Maggie and Caleb, this extension beyond their private drama to the larger crisis affecting the community. Caleb studied Samuel for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Every hand helps in times like these," he acknowledged, "and it would give you a chance to see Silverpine, to understand the life Maggie has built there." The implication was clear. Samuel needed to know what he would be asking Maggie to leave behind if he insisted on reclaiming his legal rights as her husband. Needed to see the purpose and connection she had found in this new place, with these new people. "Then it's decided," Maggie said, looking between them. "When the children are rested, we'll all go down to town together. Face what comes next as it arrives, one day at a time." It wasn't a resolution, nothing so neat or final, but it was a beginning, a path forward through the smoke and uncertainty. As if in response to this fragile accord, rain began to fall. Outside, gentle at first, then steadier, the drops pattering on the cabin roof in a rhythm as ancient as the mountains themselves. The three adults moved to the window, watching as the children danced in the unexpected shower, faces turned upward in delight at this salvation falling from the sky. From her cradle, Hope stirred, waking to this new sound with the curious alertness that characterized her approach to the world. Maggie lifted her daughter, bringing her to the window to witness this marvel. "Look, Hope," she whispered. "Rain, life for the forest, a new beginning." The baby reached out, small fingers spread as if trying to catch the droplets through the glass. Samuel and Caleb stood on either side of them, no longer adversaries in some impossible contest, but partners in the more essential task of ensuring this child's future, whatever form that might take. Beyond the cabin, smoke still rose from the ridges, and uncertainty still loomed on all horizons. But for this moment, as rain blessed the parched earth and cooled the burning forest, hope lived not just in the child's name, but in the tentative, peace taking root among those who loved her most. The fire would eventually die, the forest would regenerate, a new growth would rise from scorched earth, a transformation as painful as it was necessary, as uncertain as it was unstoppable. just like the journey that lay ahead for the unlikely family gathered at that cabin window, watching the rain wash clean a world that would never be the same again, yet somehow might still become whole. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.